Neil, help us put this war on Christmas into a broader context. Is this lineage with Bill O'Reilly and John Gibson, is that right? Or is there a deeper well that O'Reilly and others are drawing from?
Well, I think it's right to tie this story to that O'Reilly moment. So in 2004, Bill O'Reilly on his evening program began a regular series on his show called Christmas Under Siege. And this took off immediately. And as you say, there was a book written by John Gibson a couple years later. This has really been a media phenomenon of the last 10 years or so. But I do think it's tapping into cultural fears that have deeper roots, probably stretching back into the 1960s.
What kind of cultural fears?
Well, I think that with the rise of diversity and of multiculturalism, I think a lot of older Christians have felt that their own cultural prominence that they took for granted, one example here being of Christmas, that a lot of that was being pushed aside or at least minimized.
Part of that is in response to how Christmas really was the dominant American winter holiday. And there was a rise of alternative holidays beginning in the post-war period. So in 1965, you get the invention of Kwanzaa as the first African-American holiday. In 1985, 20 years later, you have Pancha Ganapati, which was a Hindu alternative to the Christmas holidays. Hanukkah grows in importance in North America in the later half of the 20th century. So there are rising alternative winter holidays that really, I think, are in response to the fact that Christmas had this unique place on the American calendar. It's the only federal holiday that has explicit religious origins.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that it exists in that way, you can hear, and I say this as a non-Christian, what the war on Christmas sounds like is, can't we just have this one day? We're being beaten back in every other regard in terms of multiculturalism in the schools. Can't we just have this one day be ours? I think that one hears, or I certainly do, in the declarations that there is a war on Christmas and that the aggressors against Christmas are bad people, this sense that like, this was this one special day. Can't we just have it? So I think, Nikki, that speaks to the uniqueness that you mentioned.
There was this moment when people did begin to question the ubiquity of Christmas greetings and Christmas celebrations, to begin to ask the question, why is it that we have these particularly government-funded celebrations of an explicitly Christian holiday? And in order to understand that, we need to understand the uniqueness of the Christmas holiday, its mixed origins, because it is explicitly Christian, but it also has a lot of pagan and secular parts to it.
Well, I think that's where we get into the fraught nature of Christmas for Christians. And I think that that's actually being lost in the current war on Christmas debate. Just to sketch out a general history of the holiday of Christmas, it wasn't really until about the mid-300s AD that the church chose December 25th as the day for Christmas. And, you know, most Christian scholars point to the fact that the celebration of Christmas is not actually a biblical event. There's no biblical command to celebrate the birth of Christ. I was researching and found a comment from Ezra Stiles, the Congregationalist minister who became the president of Yale. And in 1776, he said, "If it had been the will of Christ that the anniversary of his birth should have been celebrated, he would at least let us have known the day." So there's this idea that, you know, if the Bible doesn't make a big mention or any mention of particular day happening, and certainly of no recorded celebration of the event through the New Testament, most early Christians didn't see it as something to note, let alone to make into a holiday.
Well, I think that ties back into our conversation that we had about Halloween, this process of not eliminating pagan holidays, but Christianizing them.
Right, and so the church in about 336 AD chose December 25th as the day to mark the holiday, and they did that for a very particular reason. By tapping into the season of harvest and winter solstice festivals that were already in place. These were times of very decadent traditions where people at the end of a harvest would celebrate through a lot of drinking, a lot of, you know, everything else, the end of that holiday.
That sounds like my harvest season.
Well, you know, I was thinking it actually kind of reminds me more of our more recent phenomenon of SantaCon. You know, these roving masses of young people who do the pub crawls, wreaking havoc on a Saturday early in December. So, but in many ways, those folks of SantaCon are actually replicating more the historical pattern of Christmas celebration.
Of the
this
Bacchanal.
Absolutely. This raucous, ongoing, hedonist pleasure-seeking experience. Well, that's obviously at odds with the religious celebration of Christmas. And so most Christians through the centuries didn't have anything to do with Christmas. And if anything, the task was trying to Christianize it and to make it more Christian.
I was fascinated to learn that certainly in the colonial era of Ezra Stiles, you mentioned, but even through the 19th century, that plenty of Protestants actually looked down at all of the Christmas celebration, right, as you say, as something that was Catholic and kind of tacky and materialistic. And that is so interesting because today I think it's kind of hard in mainstream popular culture to separate Christmas from one, Christianity undefined, and two, from materialism. So to think that Protestants were rejecting that Christmas celebration, and particularly the materialistic and the showy aspect of it, as distinctly Catholic and something they weren't part of, that's really interesting to me.
And not just looking down on it, Natalia, but in the late 17th century, actually banning the celebration of Christmas in Puritan colonies.
I think just to make one more point about the Puritans, the example of the Puritans outlawing Christmas is really interesting here because it actually shows that the close relationship between church and state in that time period was what allowed for Christmas to be suppressed and only visible at like the margins of society. And it's actually the separation of church and state in the new nation that in part helps allow Christmas to begin to flourish as a holiday because you don't have church-state apparatus working together to make sure a holiday isn't happening.
And I think that those tensions run through to today. I mean, Christmas has certainly become a mainstream holiday, one that has secular components and Christian components. But my understanding is that in many Christian communities, the war on Christmas is the rising commercialism of Christmas.
Right. And that's why with our opening point, I want to draw a distinction between the war on Christmas as a media story versus a religious story. Because when you look at religious periodicals, at religious leaders who talk about war on Christmas, they are not, first of all, they're not really talking about it that much. They're not really engaging the storyline other than, as you say, Nikki, a longer cultural critique they've been making about fears of the commercialism of this religious holiday. And so if anything, what they've done is taken this war on Christmas cultural meme and turned it so that they're not supporting the conservative cultural argument as much as that they're using it to pivot to a religious critique of this is the place we've gotten to where we expect Walmart to greet us with a religious message. And that's a wrong expectation on our part.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
It's much more complicated.
Absolutely.
Because it comes off as such a soundbite. To me, who before researching this didn't think so deeply about the war on Christmas, to me it was just like another shot in the culture wars and another way to say like we hate outsiders, basically.